So can I turn then to a general opening question that I throw out at the panellists? Australia seems to have weathered the pandemic pretty much better than most, perhaps apart from New Zealand. And but that's not to say it hasn't had an impact. Some aspects of life seem to have returned. I'm actually down in Melbourne today. I'd say that they probably returned more in Sydney than Melbourne, being provocative. And others, but other parts just haven't, and they've possibly changed forever. So maybe I ask with a leading open question to each of you. Maybe I'll lead with Sally to give us your perspectives on what you're observing and whether or not there are some permanent changes that you think will continue.
Oh, well, look, Paul, there are plenty, and thank you so much for having me as part of this discussion today, a very important discussion. And we know we've been through a once-in-a-lifetime experience, all of the terms that have been used to describe the pandemic and the impact that it's had on individual lives, cities, states and nations around the world. I think that there are elements of COVID that absolutely accelerated some positive things. For example, flexible working, something we've been talking about for decades, has been accelerated and normalised in many ways as a result of the pandemic. We also saw some fantastic social outcomes. One of those was that every single rough sleeper in the city of Melbourne was provided with safe accommodation and support services during lockdown, something that had previously been thought too complex, too costly, too difficult to achieve. And we showed that we could do it in extreme circumstances. We also see that there were some transitions happening prior to COVID that have been exacerbated, if you like. For example, that transition of retail, the bricks versus clicks. What does it mean for retail, particularly in cities, on shopping strips, etc.? What was the future looking like? And COVID has really put some of those questions and outcomes into stark relief. And then we know that this pandemic has given us a chance for a reset and a reevaluation. I like to see it as the opportunity for a city renaissance. And from our perspective, that's been a couple of things. One, we've shown that we really can be a city of yes. COVID gave us the opportunity to respond quickly with programs such as outdoor dining. We considered applications at record time, we delivered infrastructure in record time, and we moved with some risk in a way that previously we haven't done. And we want to do more of the city of yes. But we also know that the rhythm of this city has changed forever, like many cities around the world. And we don't want to be daunted or overwhelmed by that. The nature of work has changed. We want to really embrace that and look for the opportunities that provides. And 9 to 5, 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, I think that's probably dead. But there is a new rhythm that can be created in our capital cities. And we want to accelerate towards that new rhythm so we can, again, respond with the right sort of policies and programs to really support the new way that the city is going to work.
Maybe that's a segue to you, Darren. The new rhythm.
Well, look, I think, first of all, we've just got to acknowledge just how fortunate we all are to be living down here in Australia versus other parts of the world. I mean, I've been on calls with investors across the globe over the last few months. Many of them haven't been in the office for the last 12 months, and they're unlikely to go back before September, October at best. And so their whole perceptions on the world and how they invest are totally different. I agree with what Sally was saying. Like, this unprecedented acceleration of change is something that we haven't experienced in our lifetimes. So, the things like the online retail versus physical retail, these changes are already underway globally, but we're a bit of a laggard here in Australia. And now, fast forward, we've caught up very, very quickly. I think when you then go to the whole work-life balance, I think it's really important to, we had this massive shock, and I think what came out of it with all these businesses was shown to be super resilient. Like, literally, we woke up, one day and we're all operating remotely. And I think, you know, you talk to CEOs and business leaders across the country, and I think as a country, we've shown ourselves to be hugely resilient, and people did pick up, and it was business as usual. But it was business as usual with a bit of a different tweak in it, and that is that, yes, you're able to sort of maintain this status quo business, but the ability to grow and innovate and all the rest of it, which I'm sure we'll get onto later in this panel, sort of flatlined a little bit. And we can sort of draw on that during the course of this discussion. This whole flexible working, that was a trend that was already alive and well in Australia, but I'll use Dexus as an example. Like, we had 3 people working flexibly properly, and one guy had relocated to the South Coast, living on a farm, and he'd come and go as he seemed fit, and 2 others were doing it. Today, 100% of the company's operating flexibly. So that trend is here to stay. But interestingly, as the pandemic sort of moved through and the senior leadership came back, what was really evident, we've never dictated that people have to be back in the office. But today we're back to 80% occupancy, which is more or less where we were pre-COVID, which is fantastic, and the business is back to normal, albeit this traditional Monday to Friday loop is a bit changed, and Mondays and Fridays are very flat. And Sally will have the data for that. We've got the data across the CBDs of Australia, and interestingly enough, I was on a global call a couple of nights ago, and it's a trend that isn't just Australian. I thought it was just the Aussies being lazy at wanting these extra weekends, but it wasn't. But that trend is very much here to stay.
Ian, did you want to sort of make a comment from your perspective?
Yeah, and thanks to you and your partners for the invitation. I'd say a couple of things. Just to pick up on one of the initial things you said, and I think Darren echoed about Australia's position. I mean, from SEEK's perspective, over the last year, I've been having regular discussions with people across sort of 10 countries for the last year: New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia, China, Brazil, Mexico. I mean, it's stunning what a different position we are in from the rest of the world. We've got Singapore, KL, Manila, Mexico City, Sao Paulo in various stages of lockdown still. And here we are sort of doing what we're doing. Yes, we've had a bit of luck, but I think there's been some excellent decision making in Australia as well. And for all the debates we've had, and there are good public debates, and they're vocal, and they should be, about what's right and what's wrong, we should be saying hats off to the people who have done the tough job of making the decisions, because that's helped a lot. And it's fine to have the debates, and we should, but we should also understand there's been some very, very good work done. In terms of where to from here, number one, we're by no means out of it at all. I've sort of taken the view, as I've spent more time in executive roles, the longer you go, the less you know. And I certainly have no ability to predict what's going to happen for the next few years. But I would say a couple of things that we've observed. Number one is that the last year has been a very emotional year for our staff. And people are not out of that really disruptive feeling, and people have reacted in very different ways. Now, I speak to my parents who are Holocaust survivors, and they haven't, relative to the human history, maybe the last year hasn't been the most traumatic, but for most of us in our lifetimes, this has been one of the biggest upheavals we've lived through, and people haven't yet, we're not out of it, people haven't recovered from it, and people actually don't know how they feel after it at the moment, and people have had radically different experiences. So my view is that all the predictions about this is the way the world is going to be are very premature. Because in just discussions we have at SEEK with our staff, people are still thinking through what they want, how they're feeling. And we see this a lot in the employment statistics as well, which we can come back to. The other thing I'd say is that this has been a really interesting period for technology, and not disruption, etc., which Darren's talked about, which I agree with entirely, but in some other ways. So to give you one example, and I say this not by contrast to any other governments, but just as an absolute statement, New South Wales government has done an absolutely unbelievably good job in the last year. Like, we are just so fortunate the job they've done. One of the main reasons goes back to the technology platform they started building in, I think, 2011, where they built a single interface between government and citizens, a really strong tech platform. And lo and behold, in 2020, it means you've got phenomenal contract tracing and an app where you can scan into any restaurant and cafe immediately. As a result of sort of 10 years of investment, not preparing for that day. it's a really interesting angle of why the government's done so well. And it sort of goes back to the fact that we're learning a lot about the benefits of quality technology and what that can do, not just to businesses, but to the way we live in government. So it's been a very interesting period from that perspective as well. It'll be fascinating to see how that sort of plays out in terms of the acceleration of some of the trends we've seen.
And I might just add to that is that in the past 3 weeks, I've been in Perth, Victoria, and New South Wales. And it is unbelievable the lack of technology spent in those other states. You know, the fact that you go into a restaurant in Perth, that someone who gives you a piece of paper, someone just doesn't care. You know, no wonder. You know, if outbreaks do happen in Perth and to Victoria to a lesser extent, it was pretty useless there as well. These states are nowhere near as well positioned as New South Wales if outbreaks do occur.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously technology, there's that whole aspect of it, but it's the acceleration of the change in which we actually work. I mean, what we're doing right now, for example, is something which has just become routine. And all of these tools have been taken up so quickly that I don't think that any of us could have imagined that it would have happened that quickly. It really has fundamentally changed the way that we work. Can I come back to you, Sally, and the concept of cities? So there's been a lot of talk about, and we'll come back to that in a minute, about whether or not you know, the focus of business is going to remain the CBD. But I was at a dinner recently with the Treasurer of New South Wales, Dominique Perrottet, who was saying that as well as New South Wales has done, the biggest challenge that they have is actually getting people back into the city still, and mainly because of public transport and people still not wanting to take public transport, and the fact that people have gotten used to not commuting. And so whilst there are pockets, particularly around where our offices are, that seem quite busy, if you go around the outskirts, it's actually quite sort of, it's thinned out. So, I mean, Victoria's obviously had an exaggerated version of this, and Melbourne has. So I suppose what are the flow-on effects of that phenomenon? I mean, I know you focused on the positives and the change, but it must be quite challenging to nonetheless.
Yeah, look, it is our biggest challenge, Paul. Just some quick stats. Pre-COVID, we'd just clicked over $104 billion in gross local product here in our municipality. That makes our city economy bigger than the ACT, Northern Territory and Tasmania combined. We drive about 25% of the state's GSP and about 8% of the nation's GDP. So what happens in our cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and beyond, it's critical. We all have an interest in how do we bring back that economic vibrancy. Pre-COVID, about 1 million people coming into the city every day, about 780,000 of those came in by public transport. So the significance of public transport for that connection of people into the city, but people to economic opportunity and jobs is absolutely key. And it has been a barrier. I keep saying it's hospital grade cleaning at the moment. There are more services than we've ever had before, so you get more of that turn up and go. And there are apps to show what carriages or trams have extra space to overcome that concern about higher density environments. The fact is we've got to build up the COVID confidence, and one of the reasons why we've been so focused on delivering events in the best way we can to bring people back in, and why we're so pleased that footy is back in Victoria, is that every time people have a good experience on public transport, they'll do that again. So if they do it for something that's fun or a cultural experience, a sporting experience, they're more likely to do it again for a work trip. We are conscious also that that commute time is so valuable. People have realised over the time of lockdown that they've got hours of their life back to spend in other ways. So how do we make the value of that commute time something for workers that is appealing, and that is some of that trade-off with what they might otherwise be doing? Let's face it, it takes 12 weeks, the experts say, to create new habits, and last year created massive new habits around the way that we work. Some of those are very positive, but some for cities are really devastating. and all of the combined efforts and sustained, as I think Ian said earlier, to bring workforces back is important. We sent out correspondence to our 20 and now 50 largest employers in the city, encouraging them around return to workplace COVID safe plans. How could we share more information? How could we support them? We've been involved in a program of going into workplaces to talk to employees about the sort of things that are irresistible, irreplicable, and completely magnets about cities for working and for stimulating other parts of people's lives. And we will continue to do that. But I do acknowledge the efforts of major employers and landlords to bring their workforces back, and we are here to support that, because early studies already show that whilst many people might say that they are individually more productive working at home, the productivity, creativity and innovation that comes from teamwork that then drives growth for companies and for city economies, state economies, national economies, comes when people are together. And so, as I said, working out that new rhythm is really important. One last point, Paul, because I'm an absolute optimist, as you've probably already worked out, is that we've had record inquiries from smaller businesses about spaces in the city. Once we understand what that new rhythm is, really encouraging and supporting those smaller artistic, creative, cultural community organisations into city spaces is something that we feel confident about. We're just not sure what those spaces are yet.
Maybe getting back to the sort of hardcore economics, also the financial aspect of it, Darren. I think you were quoted earlier this month in the media saying that every company that's looking at cutting back office space, there's others that are kind of looking to grow. So from, landlords' perspective, what are those opportunities? Where are the risks? Like, what's the shift?
Yeah, look, there's been so much noise about COVID and the world's changed forever. I think, to be very clear, like, I'm a big believer in globalisation. It's been happening for the past 100 years. And guess what? I will put my message out there today. The globalisation period is not over. Now, what you're seeing is normally we, Australia, are a laggard in the global trends. Now, because of what COVID's done, we're one of the first countries to be out and operating successfully, touch wood. As Ian said, we're not through it yet, and hopefully we don't have further sort of breakouts of the disease. So the trend we're seeing in Sydney, and it's evidenced by the deal flow, and Sydney is probably operating at about 60% occupancy, give or take, today compared to where it was. The problem is we've got no stats of what the actual occupancy of it was of the cities pre-COVID. So let's say the real occupancy was sort of 80 to 90. So we're at 60 here today. Melbourne is a laggard because of what happened there. It's about 6 months behind, I would imagine, Sally, depending on how we go. And so the press and everything jumps onto all the negative news and no one wants to go to work. But I'll give you some stats today. So till the end of April, from the 1st of July, we've done 292 leasing deals across the country in the CBDs predominantly. This is just our office leasing. That's over 164,000 square metres of space. That's about 30% greater than it was this time last year. So who's taking space? Professional services companies, funnily enough, the same ones you hear are cutting back space, legal, accounting, engineering services. Technology companies are growing strongly. The same companies that are using in their marketing spin, we're never going to be in the office again, are spending billions of dollars on offices, both here in Sydney, and leasing, funnily enough, in London, in the US, across the globe, they're leasing space, and I'll touch on that in a minute. And government at all levels is taking space, which is interesting as well. And so the other thing that I was quite worried on last year when everyone was locked at home was this whole trend about companies relocating back into the cities. And so even with some of those deals, if I get down to some of the micro, they're larger organisations that are relocating to be closer to where their customer base is going to be, coming from the fringes of Sydney, which I agree are a bit ghost towny at the moment, because maybe they're the people that don't need to be in the office, into the core locations, which is luckily enough where we own, to be closer to their customer bases. And the whole rationale behind this, and I spoke to the leasing team, I meet with them every Monday, the talent that we all need to grow our companies still wants to live, work and play in the cities. And so that trend hasn't changed. I was quite worried about that last year. Are people going to be more in the suburbs? And there's all these stats and the money being spent in the suburbs. But now as people are getting back to work, the businesses are realising that they need to be located in the cities to attract the best talent. And we're a bit different to the US and other countries. In the US, people tend to move around a lot easier than they do here in Australia. And as a result, it's easier, like I'm in the Hamptons, I'm going back to my home state. In Australia, people do tend to gravitate to the cities. And, I've run various businesses over the last 20 years. And I still remember, one time when I was running Colonial, when working for Ian, I offered a good executive, a CEO's job, which would have been about 3 levels above where he was going. And all he had to do was relocate to Auckland and run Kiwi Income Property Trust. And this guy would have sent his career off to the stratosphere. No, wasn't leaving Melbourne. I was just like, what? You keep telling me you're ready for the next thing and you're going to be promoted? He goes, no, I love it here in Melbourne. So that's the mentality you've got to deal with. Sally, he obviously didn't want to spend time in Sydney or Perth.
Sally's details. Yeah.
But that's the kind of mentality you're dealing with. And even, I look at many of my sort of peers, and I've lived in Perth, Melbourne, and Sydney, but people that I'd worked with over the years, they just don't like moving. It's a lot different mentality to some of the overseas countries. So to wrap all that and just come back to the stats. So of those sort of 292 deals, probably less than 5 have taken less space. So what's going to happen is the density of Australian offices got ridiculously tight over the last decade as people was trying to scream, get more people into less space. So what's happened now is those that are re-signing are reworking their office spaces to create more collaboration spaces. There's probably going to be less people in that space, but there's going to be more, square meterage. And things are different. Like if you look around here, I'm in an office for the first time in 20 years. I love being an open plan with everyone. I can hear what's going on and you're part of it. And with all these Zoom, I was sitting on an investment committee meeting and having a few words to say, and all of a sudden it was vibrating around the office. So I've had to move back in the office to just have more meetings like this. So that's the style of how the space is being used is changing. And if you talk to the tech companies, and Ian will probably elaborate more on this, but the culture piece, the collaborations piece, and the innovation piece, the culture in particular, if you've just got all these workers sitting at home, they're going to work for me or they're going to work for Ian. Whoever pays them another $1, they'll probably just move. I mean, they're not going to be in the Dexus culture or the Seek culture. The culture is really important as you look to grow and push a company forward. The innovation, maybe in the future when our sort of kids come through, they're going to be more used to innovating online. But, we noticed particularly, and we've been very active in the last few months, and everyone goes, well, why and how? Because we've been back in the office for, since July last year, thinking and strategizing together. When you get the whiteboard, you're throwing it around. It's so much easier to do that in person still. It was easy to run a business status quo online, by easy. It was a challenge, but it happened because you're just not doing anything new. But when you want to do M&A or sales or just think of stuff differently, it's much easier to do it in person. You can pick up the body language easier. It's really easy for guys like Sally or Ian and myself to operate online full time because we've got 30-year relationships. You can pick up the phone, you've met people, you know them well. But try cold calling or starting a new fund to some client in Germany that you haven't met before. It's a real challenge. So, you go back to, I closed a deal at the start of COVID between Sydney, Melbourne, Singapore and London, which is easy because I knew all the personalities, but I didn't have my 3 team members in my office. I went into my home office, shut the door. 2 hours later, I hadn't given up a week of my life traveling around the globe and the deal was done. But I didn't have my 2 or 3 teammates that are going to be the people that are going to do that in 10 years' time. So there's a whole lot of elements, but I sit here today a lot more comfortable about the future of office and a lot more comfortable about the future of the CBDs, seeing these global companies, small and large, taking space and getting on with business.
Yeah, well, Ian, that's probably a good way. That is a good segue, and I would certainly agree with that, Darren. And that's definitely the view we've come to at ABL is that, without the collaborative sort of environment that you get from people being in the office, there's just a loss of culture in the organisation, and that's why we've been back in the office in Sydney since last July, and now everyone's back in the office, and I can't really see that changing. And the people that move away from that are going to, I think, dilute their culture. But I'm interested in what you think about that, Ian. But also, I am interested in whether employers and employees' expectations around that are aligned, because there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect with the expectations. Employers, a lot of them want people to come back, and a lot of employees don't want to come back, especially around the globe. But I mean, it is happening here. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, there's no one answer is the answer, which everyone's going to ask for their money back with an insightful answer like that. But I'd say a number of different things. There are a few different elements to this. Number one, just to pick up on Darren's point, we've had a lot of discussions about this now for a number of months, and like every company, we feel that the culture that we've got is special. And in Seek's case, it's sort of a bit different from many companies because, Andrew, the co-founder, is still there. It's still got that history and that sort of startup mentality. And the way people interact together, et cetera, in the office is definitely part of what's made it special. So we all know having people with each other is really important. So there's no doubt about that. And I'll come back to something Sally said about that in a minute. That said, every team we've got delivering value for customers now is cross geography, like literally people in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Melbourne, Sydney, collaborating every day, and they have been for a while. And so if you've got multinational companies, the whole idea of let's all get into the office, unless you're going to run it in a very siloed way, is completely inconsistent with your geographic footprint. So this has been very helpful because it's actually given us an opportunity, by contrast to what I just said, to say you can actually build great team cultures with people not seeing each other very often. How do you do that? What have we learned about how you do that? So the two things sit alongside each other, that you've got developers in Kuala Lumpur speaking to product people in Melbourne, collaborating to talk about what to do for customers everywhere, which is fabulous. So on the one hand, everyone wants to get together. That's an important part of the culture. On the other hand, you can collaborate cross geography. Where does that all net out? We'll just have to wait and see. Now, that may be different, particularly from an office like yours, Paul, which is largely, local offices, even though you've got multinational clients. So different firms are going to think very differently. The only last thing I'd say about this, and just to hark back to what Sally said, and taking a totally different lens on this, which is with my hat on as the chairman of the Sydney Theatre Company. A year ago, we were wondering, A, when will we get back into theatres? And B, will people want to come back and watch theatre, right? Now, on the first thing, and again, both federal and state government was just outstanding on this, and they were helpful, and they cared about the arts, and they were collaborative. And together with all the advice, we got back into the theatres in the second half of September, only on 25% capacity, but we were there. By February, we were at 100% capacity, right? Everything sold out, and people were desperate to come back. Even at a time, by the way, where they still had to wear masks through a performance. I love theatre. I don't love it quite as much wearing a mask, but I wasn't going to miss it, and nor were hundreds of other people. So that's fascinating. Now, we think that's great news for live arts, by the way, because that's one thing you cannot do over Zoom. Like being in the room with the artists, co-creating with them can't be done over Zoom. So that's why I keep coming. There's all these different things going on, and I just can't yet make sense of how they're all going to fit together and chart the future. What I do dismiss is anybody who says the future is X or the future is Y, right? Because I just don't know. I'm a little bit in Darren's camp and Sally's camp, which is to say the cities aren't dead, offices aren't dead, people are coming back. But how we use them, what we use them for, I think that script's still got a while to play out.
And I think, I think what will happen is if you need to spend a day just crunching through numbers, you'll do that at home. But so this whole flexibility thing is, which makes it hard for public transport and how you're going to set that up for when's the peak time going to be. But there'll actually be a benefit, I think, in the long run out of all this. And the cities will need to be 24-hour cities. And by the way, the airports will need to be 24-hour airports to deal with it.
And do you think, I mean, there's any change? I mean, we're ahead of everyone, clearly, internationally. Do you think there'll be any differences long term, or it'll all sort of even out?
I think if you just go back to 9/11, and there's been a number of times in history where people have called the end of this, the end of that, things seem to get back to normal, but the benefits of what we're using, like the technology, and will hopefully accelerate productivity, hopefully, as a result. But I think there'll be some kind of normality in the next couple of years, back to where we were with, as Ian said, the benefits of technology, meaning that international companies can operate more seamlessly using this technology. Like, it's very strange. You talk to your staff and they go, like, we'd much rather, the group presentations in person, and then 3/4 of them go, but when you talk on Zoom, we feel more connected to you when you're talking across the country. So, horses for courses.
I also think, Paul, that and we're seeing this in the public discourse, the nature of the during and post-COVID world in terms of how cities and countries are adapting is moving from how well did you manage the virus to how well are you managing the rollout of vaccinations? What does that mean for borders, right? So the actual conditions under which cities and economies are going to thrive are changing even in the COVID world. And again, I don't know what the answers to some of these questions are, but I do know that your ability to get some of those things right, you could be in a position where on a relative basis in 2 years, Australia is doing even better than the rest of the world, or actually in that phase, we haven't done quite as well as others, and therefore things are shifting. So again, there's still a bit to play out there.
That's a good point, Ian. I think because we are ahead, there's a bit of complacency going on, and therefore you've got herd immunity and good immunisation going on globally, and we could get a little lost at this point.
Well, talking about governments and good and bad actions, getting local, Sally, there's been a fair bit of commentary, including from many of our Victorian clients, about the proposed changes to land tax and stamp duty, foreshadowed by the Victorian Treasurer, and obviously much of that comment has been critical of both the timing of it as well as the adverse effect possibly on stimulating the Victorian economy just at a time when that's sort of much needed. So I'm interested in all of your views really on this, but perhaps start with you, Sally.
Yeah, thank you. As I said earlier, we believe that this recovery is going to take time, and particularly given, as we've discussed this morning, we're not going back to the way it was. That would almost be a simple equation. It's going back to something that's quite different. So the sense of a sustained effort around recovery is real. It's why we were in deficit budget last year. We will have our budget release next week, and it'll be a deficit budget again, because we will continue to invest as much as we can in our local economy to support our investors, our business owners, our ratepayers, residents, etc. I think the timing of what's been put out by the state government in terms of the land tax and stamp duty, it is frustrating, because we're trying to do everything we can to encourage more investment. Frankly, it's not even about the new, it's about sustaining existing businesses and investment and giving them every opportunity. We're all saying we want to be the easiest place to do business. We want to facilitate investment more than ever before, and we really have to demonstrate that. I know some of your questions coming up, if we get to them, are about change of uses and the way that government policies and programs work to free up private sector activity, and that is certainly an aim. Lockup's on at the moment for the state government budget, and we'll wait to see what else is in there, because certainly in all our discussions, their recognition of this sustained recovery and focus on that has been very consistent. So we'll wait to see what else is in there. But it is why they agreed to, we've already had a $100 million recovery fund. We've now agreed a $200 million joint revitalisation fund over the next 2 financial years. That's because we recognise the need for that ongoing investment. We have certainly learned a lot during COVID about how we can simplify our processes, how we can move at a pace, and part of that will be new groups within our organisation to facilitate investment, to facilitate construction, and to facilitate development. And we've seen we could streamline during COVID on programs like outdoor dining, for example, but we also approved $2.3 billion worth of projects last year, and we're involved in the government's fast tracking of significant projects. We're taking those lessons and applying them going forward to ensure that we aren't creating barriers to private sector investment. Now, I'm not saying we're going to get that all right immediately, but that's certainly what our aim is. And my shorthand words for that is to be a city of yes. And that is a big focus for us internally, both looking at our investment, but also looking at how we are facilitating and supporting investment in the city.
Do you have a view on, as an investor, Darren, on these proposed changes?
I do, but let me just...
I'm just guessing that you might.
Yeah. Sally and her team have done a wonderful job down there in Melbourne, and it is one of the, as far as some certainty, once you start the process in development, etc., it's one of the better jurisdictions to do it in. But look, real estate is a soft target. We've done more than a share of the heavy lifting through COVID. I think we were the only industry that actually had to give relief without having it to defer it. So we've got broad shoulders, but this is outrageous tax grab. It is going to impact investment, because at the end of the day, capital is finite, and if I can get better returns by putting it into New South Wales, Queensland, WA, South Australia, that's probably what I'm going to send it. And if a project's marginal and I've got to get a greater tax impost down in Victoria, well, that's where the dollars will go. And I think what they failed to realise is a lot of this just goes to the returns of the superannuants at the end of the day. And it also gets passed on to business, and they're trying to attract businesses, not just local, but internationally. And, one of Victoria used to be so good at it. I remember 5 years ago when we'd be talking to international businesses in the US or Asia and trying to attract them into this country. And we'd go to New South Wales and they'd say, g'day, how are you? Bugger off, get in the queue. This is a great spot. But Victoria would, take them under their wing, help them with incentives, et cetera, and did a really good job. This is really going to put that process on the back foot, because New South Wales has got its act together and is doing a wonderful job. It's a centralised agency. You've got the federal government also assisting now with various visas and other things through Peter Verwer. So we are going, for the first time, this country is seriously doing the right thing to compete properly against Hong Kong and Singapore and other countries that do this very, very well. Israel is another one that does it well. So we're getting our act together, and then Victoria goes and does this. As I said in the press, it's an own goal, and it will hit them over time.
Turning to there's a few questions popping up, and one of them perhaps ask you, Ian, which is, has the pause in migration, both inward and outward, travel movements, had a noticeable impact on recruitment? And while there's no skilled migration, we're also not suffering the brain drain that we've had of Australian talent over many years. So it's a bit of a counter there. And wondering.
So the answer to your first question, as best I can gather, is emphatically yes, right? So we've got more jobs on our site than ever in SEEK's history, and fewer applicants per job than we've seen since 2012. We can see from candidate activity that it's as strong as ever. So people are doing a lot of looking, but they're doing a lot less moving. Some of which is probably due, if you look at sentiment surveys, to the fact people are a bit more conservative at the moment for all the stuff I talked about earlier, less likely to move jobs. So that's part one. But some industries like hospitality, I go down, I'm fortunate to have a great cafe down the road, Apache. Whenever I'm down there, and a lot of different restaurant owners go there, I'm always bailed out by people saying, the ad's not working, right? We've got an ad on your site, it's not working. And I've even pulled some numbers, and one of them, just to give you an example, and this was an outlier, had 2,000 views, 200 click-throughs, one applicant. And in industries like hospitality, it's just there, and if you therefore ask anecdotally, and I don't have data on this, but a lot of it is because these jobs were filled by people coming in from overseas, and either through preference or the fact that employment's coming back, they're very, very difficult to fill. So that is undoubtedly a factor. I think the big question, and this sort of goes also to government budgets, et cetera, is going to be, the government is, everybody can agree, is playing an unprecedented role in terms of its size in the economy at the moment. central banks and governments' proportion of economic activity against any historic precedent is just huge. It's definitely been the right thing, but everyone can agree that's probably not sustainable. And so the question is, as government, when will government be forced to reduce its presence in the economy? How will they do it? And what will that cause is another of these really big questions out there. So what that does to sort of employment markets, et cetera, again, over anywhere from 1 to 3 years will be pretty interesting to watch.
And I think the long-awaited wage inflation is going to come out of this lack of migration, because I was with Chris Lucas has just opened a wonderful building that I think Sally and I are going to open his restaurant together. He needs 450 staff to open that 80 Collins restaurant precinct that he has created. And he's struggling to get the people down there. And I don't know, other restaurants in Melbourne have not, have cut back their hours because they just can't get these full-time, the wait staff and everything that they've relied on with the overseas students and the immigrants over the past years.
Yeah, I mean, this will be a very interesting thing to watch. So if you look at the Reserve Bank, obviously, a lot of very smart people are pretty confident in their view that wage inflation is still a while off, and, they've got great data. If you take a very microeconomic view of this and you look at, there are 600 different employment markets or whatever it is, there is no doubt that there is a supply-demand imbalance, which at least in some pockets of the economy would have a wage response. So the question is, how big are those and what's the response and what does that do to the macro? And that is probably as big a question as exists in sort of global macroeconomics as there is at the moment, because the moment inflation, particularly wage inflation, comes back, then the whole sort of world changes. So it'll be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of real estate people on this call, but we are seeing inflation coming through in construction pricing, and obviously there's big infrastructure spends across the country, and we know what happens when that comes through. So we're in a very interesting period. As you say, no one knows the answer, but you've got to take it all into account.
There are some cohorts, though, that really we've had the double whammy, and international students is one of those. Not only do they add enormously to our education sector, but of course they are essential workers in so many of our sectors, and so that's been particularly hard. But if we can do the right thing and everyone get their vaccine and we get those borders open again, we can also see the double benefit if we can attract them back in numbers as well.
Well, you talked about, talked about certain inflationary trends, but asset inflation is something that seems obviously going on in the residential market, and also in certain pockets of the office market as well, and obviously driven by historically low interest rates. But what else is there to it, and how long can it continue?
Look, I think that what you've had
can be reversed without tipping the whole of Australia over.
Look, I think there's a lot of volatility globally, as we've said, and also in the share market. So a lot of pension capital is happy to take 10-year plus views and go into real assets. And so whether it be infrastructure or real estate, they've both been beneficiaries globally. And for all the reasons that we've discussed today, Australia's positioned really well. If I'm a pension fund sitting in Germany or Asia, and I'm looking to allocate capital globally, this is one of the safer havens, has been for a long time to do that. So yes, little tax imposts like this don't help, but people are still happy to allocate capital down there. And with recent sort of processes that we have been involved in, the depth is, it's not 20 deep, but it's probably 10 deep. And they're happy with returns, total returns in the 5 to 6 or 5 to 5.5 range. That's total return, and that will satisfy their requirements. So, and then you've got Aussie super funds also looking to invest in that kind of product. So it's quite deep, but it's all about the quality end of the spectrum. And obviously, with all the trends we've spoken about today, you don't want to own or be looking to sell B grade real estate, because the tenants don't want to be in B grade real estate. They want to be in in a normal cycle, which is what we're in, just exacerbated by COVID. Tenants upgrade to better quality buildings because they're going to get more incentive. Staff want to be in the better quality buildings, and the capital wants to own the better quality buildings. So it's the secondary quality buildings. And then your flip side with regard to inflation, having run this kind of real estate for a long time. You know, let's say it's 2 years away, maybe, because you've still got the technological impact of, you know, bringing costs down. Let's say my gut feel it's about 2 years away, and what you don't want to be at that time is over-levered. So if you can run a reasonable level of gearing and have the better quality real estate, you'll be fine. But if you've got secondary real estate that's over-levered, unfortunately, a lot of syndicates end up like that. They're the kind of assets that get in quite a bit of trouble, and then it's back to Ian's old employer to work that kind of stuff through. It's a normal business cycle.
Perhaps I'll just change the conversation slightly to back to government. There's a sort of question here about the you know, before the crisis, the business sector, I think in particular, voiced concerns about how we're over-governed in Australia with all these different layers of government, plenty of criticism of duplication and inconsistency across the Federation. We've seen some remarkable trends in the last year with the reassertion of states and sort of understanding really that what they had. And I suppose, do you think the attitudes have shifted from where they were before? Are people comfortable with where we are now in terms of, I suppose, in terms of a move away from, in many ways, from the Federation? And I suppose interested to know, Sally, from you in particular, whether, you know, the role of Lord Mayors and, you know, whether it's changed.
Paul, really good questions again, that where COVID's had a big impact and we'll see some change. Just a couple of observations. Firstly, the Council of Capital City Lord Mayors, it's a great organisation. We've been working very closely together. Mostly that has been about sharing information on responses and forward-looking policies so that we can learn from each other. And I think that's been a great feature of COVID is even I'm on 2 forums internationally with mayors, and we meet now every 2 weeks. And it's been fabulous, particularly from the sharing and learning perspective. We also, a feature of COVID has been, and I know that there's argy-bargy in the public from time to time, but the 3 levels of government have never worked more closely together. And I think, to your point, that the public and the private sector would welcome to see more of that coordination and cooperation across the 3 levels of government. Now, one stark example for us was that as each level of government, federal and state, looked at what support packages they could put out during the pandemic, we then looked to what the gaps were, and then we played that role in the gaps. International students, I'll just mention them again, and providing support given that they were ineligible for most other programs. And I think it was good to see that sort of coordination, the fast tracking of permits I mentioned earlier on projects of significance. That was an absolute coordination of effort across state and local government moving forward. So we would want to see that continue. Will we be able to address every inefficiency as we go forward? Of course not, but there's certainly a heightened recognition that cooperation has benefits for everyone, even from our perspective, from a resourcing element. It's been really important for us on how we shift our workforce and where we put our investment. So I think that has been one of the silver linings out of COVID, and we're really keen for that to continue.
Well, on that note, I think we're almost out of time, and I know that all of you have to run. And I suppose I just wanted to say thank you very much again for accepting the invitation and participating today. I think each of you obviously brought a very substantial and different perspective to the conversation. And it's definitely something that pretty much everybody starts the conversation by asking about. Are you back in the office? So it's definitely on it's definitely on everybody's mind. And I think one thing's for sure is that Ian probably does win the day by saying nobody has any idea. And for that insight,
really
that's why I pay you the big bucks. Yes.
So 3 out of 4 of us are in the office though, Paul. If this is a little survey today,
it is.
75%.
Yeah,
that's right. So, that's right. Ian's in his bedroom, but everyone else is back at work. So no, really seriously, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. You're all very busy, and it's been a fascinating discussion. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul.
See you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great forum. Thanks.